The Pacific sun had a way of burning through hope. In the spring of 1945, as the war edged toward its violent climax, the islands of the Philippines were littered with wreckage, broken planes, charred palm groves, villages reduced to silence. For the Japanese soldiers who still clung to their units in scattered pockets, capture meant only one thing: death. Rumors spread faster than jungle fire, that Americans shot prisoners on sight, that surrender was dishonor worse than execution. For those raised under the imperial creed, surrender was not simply forbidden, it was unthinkable. Yet war has a way of forcing the unthinkable. On a sweltering afternoon near Luzon, a band of Japanese medical orderlies, barely more than boys, with rifles slung across shoulders and surgical kits strapped to their backs, found themselves cornered. The remnants of their regiment had scattered after an artillery barrage, leaving them lost in the jungle. Starvation gnawed at their stomachs, their canteens rattled empty. They stumbled into an American patrol before they even realized the forest had gone silent around them. The moment stretched like the pull of a bowstring. American rifles rose, the Japanese dropped theirs. A few fell to their knees, hands shaking, eyes hollow. They expected the sharp crack of gunfire to follow. One of them, a 22-year-old medic named Hiroshi Tanaka, closed his eyes and muttered the final prayer he had memorized as a child. He imagined his mother's garden, the sound of cicadas at dusk, the laughter of his younger sister. Death was easier if you could wrap it in memory. But the rifles did not fire. Instead, an American lieutenant barked orders. The Japanese were stripped of their weapons, searched roughly, then shoved into a clearing where other prisoners huddled. There were no bullets, only ropes binding their wrists. The execution they had feared became a lote, Nang March instead. Every step northward deepened their confusion. Why had the Americans spared them? Each mile revealed new evidence that the war they thought they understood was unraveling. Burned tanks rusted beside the road. Columns of American trucks roared past, piled high with crates of supplies, food and ammunition. The sheer scale of it dwarfed anything the Japanese had believed possible. Tanaka, his ribs pressing against his skin, wondered how a nation could possess such endless abundance while his own comrades died gnawing on roots and bark. After 3 days of marching, they reached an American camp built on the ruins of a sugar plantation. Barbed wire encircled the grounds, watchtowers rising above palm trees. Inside, hundreds of American prisoners of war lay sprawled across the earth. Their uniforms hung in tatters, their bodies little more than bone and skin. Malaria glazed their eyes with fever. Some coughed so hard they could no longer speak. Others simply stared, empty of all expression. The Japanese prisoners froze at the sight. These were the very men they had been told to despise, enemies who, according to propaganda, were pampered and weak. Yet here they were, wasted and broken, shadows of humanity. The American commander of the camp, a weary major with deep lines carved into his face, turned to the Japanese prisoners. His words came sharp, filtered through an interpreter. "You will save them." The Japanese stared back in disbelief. Tanaka blinked, sure he had misunderstood. Save them? These were enemies, Americans, men whose bombs had destroyed their villages, whose fire had consumed their regiments. Surely this was a cruel trick, a prelude to torture. One of his companions whispered, "They mean to mock us, force us to tend their sick, then kill us after." But the order came again, firmer. "You are medics, you will treat our prisoners, the Americans shoved them forward. Supplies were dumped at their feet, bandages, quinine tablets, cans of disinfectant. The Japanese stared at the abundance with wide eyes. In their own units, such items had vanished months ago. Here they lay in piles, as if plucked from the earth by magic. Hesitantly, Tanaka knelt beside the first stretcher. The man on it was barely breathing, his chest rising in shallow bursts. His dog tags identified him as a corporal from Kansas. The infection in his leg had spread so far that the skin oozed pus. Tanaka swallowed hard, his training whispering in his ear even as his mind screamed rebellion. He cleaned the wound, applied fresh dressings, whispered to himself in Japanese as his hands worked. Not enemy, not friend, just a man. All around him, the other Japanese medics bent to their tasks. They exchanged wary glances, but moved with the same precision they had once used in field hospitals for their own countrymen. The Americans stood guard, rifles slung, suspicion etched into their faces. Yet they did not interfere. That night, when the work was done, Tanaka and his companions were herded into a corner of the camp. They were given bowls of rice, real rice, not the handfuls of husk and grass they had scavenged in the jungle. The warmth filled their bellies, but not their confusion. Why spare them? Why trust them with the lives of fellow Americans? Sleep did not come easily. Tanaka lay awake, listening to the coughs of the POWs, the distant hum of generators, the rustle of guards' boots. He remembered his regiment's commander, who had once told him that Americans had no mercy, that capture meant certain death. Yet here he was, alive, with rice in his stomach and bandages in his hands. The world no longer made sense. The next morning the test grew harsher. A group of American prisoners were carried in from a jungle work detail, their bodies riddled with tropical ulcers. The smell was unbearable. The American major pointed at Tanaka and barked an order. "You, save them!" Tanaka's hands shook as he opened his satchel. One ulcer had eaten through to the bone. He worked slowly, cleaning, cutting away necrotic tissue, applying ointment from a tin he had never before seen in such quantity. The American moaned in agony, then whispered something through cracked lips. Tanaka did not understand the words, but the interpreter leaned close and murmured, "He says thank you." The phrase struck Tanaka harder than any blow. Thank you? From an enemy? His vision blurred. He pressed on with his work. By evening he scribbled a line in a scrap of paper he kept hidden in his boot. "We believed capture meant dishonor. Yet today I saved an enemy who thanked me. I no longer know the borders of shame and honor." In the days that followed, suspicion lingered on both sides. Some Americans spat when the Japanese approached. Some Japanese muttered that their work was humiliation, not mercy. But slowly a fragile pattern emerged. The medics worked. The Americans watched. Lives were saved. One night, as lanterns flickered against the palm-thatched walls, Tanaka overheard an American chaplain speaking through the interpreter. "In war, men kill, but sometimes men heal. Tonight, you have chosen the second." The words sat heavy in Tanaka's chest. By the end of the first week, the camp had changed. The air was still heavy with sickness, but hope flickered where despair had been. American prisoners whispered that the Japanese medics were not butchers, but healers. The guards still kept rifles ready, but the barrels no longer pointed quite so sharply. And among the Japanese themselves, doubt began to creep into convictions once thought unshakable. On the seventh night, Tanaka lay awake and whispered to the man beside him. "We expected execution. Instead they gave us bandages. What do we call this?" The other medics stared at the dark ceiling. "Perhaps we call it mercy." The jungle did not forgive weakness. Even inside the American camp, where barbed wire and guards promised structure, the heat pressed down like a hand determined to smother. Sweat-soaked uniforms before dawn. Flies swarmed over every wound. The smell of infection clung to the air, refusing to leave no matter how much disinfectant the Americans poured across the floors. For the Japanese medics, every day was a battle without rifles. They rose at dawn, their wrists still raw from ropes that had since been removed, and were marched to the rows of stretchers where American prisoners lay gasping. At first, their hands trembled each time they touched an American body, as though the very act were treason against the emperor. But repetition dulled fear, and soon they moved with the automatic rhythm of men who had treated wounds 100 times before. Tanaka found himself kneeling beside the same corporal from Kansas he had treated that first night. The man's fever had broken, but his leg still oozed with infection. Tanaka worked silently, aware of the rifle pointed in his direction. When he finished, the corporal whispered the word again, faint but audible. "Thank you." The syllables struck Tanaka like a hammer. Gratitude from an enemy was more disorienting than hatred. His companion, Sergeant Nakamura, muttered bitterly in Japanese as they walked back to their corner one evening. "Do you not see, Tanaka? They humiliate us. They make us slaves to their weakness. Better to die with a rifle than to kneel with a bandage." Tanaka said nothing. He remembered the corporal's pale face, the whispered thanks. Perhaps Nakamura was right. Perhaps it was humiliation. But humiliation that saved a life seemed different than the kind that ended in death. The Americans did not trust them fully, not yet. Every vial of medicine was counted. Every instrument was inspected. Guards hovered close, enough that even the faintest misstep could mean death. Yet, despite suspicion, the Americans kept bringing them patients. The workload grew until exhaustion made Tanaka's fingers clumsy. At night he collapsed into restless dreams where his mother's face blurred with the faces of American prisoners, where cries of "Doc, help me" echoed in both languages. One night the test of suspicion returned. A prisoner developed convulsions after receiving quinine for malaria. Rumors spread like sparks. The Japanese had poisoned him. The guards stormed into the barracks, rifles cocked. Tanaka's heart thundered as they dragged him forward. He shouted in broken English, "Not poison! Medicine! Malaria!" The camp's American doctor, a weary man with grey stubble, shoved past the guards. He examined the prisoner, checked the dosage, and finally waved the rifles down. "Side effect," he muttered, "not sabotage." The rifles lowered, but the memory lingered like smoke. That night Tanaka scribbled in his hidden paper, "I came closer to death today, not by bullet, but by mistrust. Mercy is fragile here, balanced on suspicion." The days blurred into a rhythm of labor and fear. And yet, cracks appeared in the wall of hatred. One afternoon, as Tanaka adjusted a bandage, a young American medic crouched beside him. "You," the boy said slowly, pointing at Tanaka's chest. "Doctor?" Tanaka nodded. "Yes, doctor." The medic hesitated, then handed him a cigarette. The exchange was silent, awkward, but in that moment the line between captor and captive bent just slightly. Another day, Adler, one of the older Japanese medics, sat humming as he stitched a prisoner's arm. The tune was a childhood folk song from Kyoto. An American nurse paused, listening, then hummed the melody back in imitation. Adler froze, then smiled despite himself. Music had crossed where words could not. But not all moments were gentle. One evening, the guards dragged in a group of newly rescued American POWs. These men had endured a jungle march so brutal that their feet were nothing but raw flesh, their backs lined with welts. Some collapsed before they reached the cots. The Japanese medics stood frozen as the Americans shoved them forward. "Treat them!" the interpreter barked. Tanaka's stomach twisted. He had heard stories of Japanese guards forcing such marches. Perhaps these very men had suffered at the hands of soldiers wearing his uniform. Now he was ordered to clean their wounds, to salve their blistered flesh. His hands trembled as he worked, shame prickling through every movement. One prisoner glared at him with eyes burning from a skull stretched thin by hunger. Tanaka could not meet his gaze. That night, Nakamura hissed in the dark. "Do you see? They make us wash away our nation's sins with their bandages. It is mockery." Tanaka whispered back, "Maybe it is chance to undo, not mockery." Nakamura spat into the dirt. "You are weak." But even Nakamura's bitterness faltered weeks later when a German POW was brought into the camp. Starved, delirious, the man spoke a language no American medic understood. The Americans shoved him toward the Japanese medics, hoping perhaps that one enemy might understand another. Nakamura surprised them all by kneeling without complaint, tending to the man's cracked lips and festering sores. Later he admitted in a whisper, "He was soldier, same as me. If I let him die, then what am I?" Trust remained fragile, but seeds had been planted. The Americans began to let the medics move more freely within the camp, always under guard but with fewer glares of suspicion. A chaplain visited one night, gathering prisoners and medics alike in the open courtyard. Through an interpreter, he spoke of forgiveness, not as absolution for crimes, but as a path through survival. Tanaka sat among the crowd, listening to words he barely understood, but somehow felt. One diary entry from that night, written in cramped kanji on the back of a ration wrapper, read, "Tonight, enemies prayed in the same circle. I do not know if God listened, but for a moment I believed he might." By late January, the Japanese medics had become essential to the camp. They amputated infected limbs, drained abscesses, and nursed men back from the edge of death. American guards still watched closely, but suspicion had shifted into something grudgingly respectful. The breaking point came when an American captain collapsed with appendicitis. The camp doctor declared surgery the only hope, but his own hands shook with exhaustion. He turned to the Japanese medics. "You, help." The operation stretched into the night. Sweat dripped into Tanaka's eyes as he held clamps, as Adler stitched with hands steadier than men half his age. When the captain survived, the camp seemed to shift on its axis. Guards spoke less sharply. POWs whispered that the Japanese had saved not just privates, but officers. That night, an American nurse passed Tanaka a slip of paper with halting Japanese written across it. "You saved him. Thank you." Tanaka held the paper for hours, his throat too tight to speak. Yet even as trust grew, the war beyond the barbed wire raged on. Rumors of bombings in Tokyo filtered into the camp. Some Japanese medics whispered of surrender, others scoffed, insisting the empire would fight to the last man. Tanaka listened in silence, torn between pride and the undeniable truth that mercy had already rewritten the war within him. The rains came in February, hammering the tin roofs of the American camp until conversation was swallowed by the roar. Mud rose in thick currents beneath boots. The sick grew weaker in the damp, their lungs filling, their coughs rattling in rhythm with the storm. The Japanese medics worked through it all, their uniforms clinging wet to their skin, their hands raw from disinfectant and water that never seemed to dry. For Tanaka, the camp had become a paradox. Each morning he woke expecting a rifle shot, a final punishment for wearing the enemy's uniform. Yet each morning brought instead another stretcher, another wound to clean, another life balanced on the edge of survival. His hands had become his shield. So long as they healed, they lived. The corporal from Kansas, once feverish and near death, now sat propped against a wall, his face still gaunt but his voice stronger. When Tanaka passed, the man raised a shaky hand. "Doc," he rasped, using the word with a kind of clumsy affection. Tanaka froze, then gave the smallest bow of his head. No interpreter was needed for that exchange. Not every American accepted them. One guard, whose brother had died in the Bataan campaign, spat whenever the medics walked past. His eyes carried hatred that no act of healing could soften. Yet even he never interfered as long as the work continued. Perhaps even hate recognized necessity. The test that defined them came in March. A truck arrived bearing American prisoners rescued from a jungle work site. They were more skeleton than men, ribs pressing through skin, eyes wide with the terror of starvation. Some collapsed before reaching the cots. The American major gestured sharply. "All hands, now!" The Japanese medics moved without hesitation. They spooned broth into cracked lips, bathed sores with clean water, cut away rags that barely clung to the bodies. For hours they worked, until one of the rescued men, delirious, grabbed Tanaka's wrist. His voice was faint, but the interpreter whispered the words, "Don't let me die, Doc." That night, Tanaka wrote in his hidden scraps, "The enemy calls me doctor. The word feels heavier than any rank I have ever worn." As weeks turned into months, something shifted in the camp. The Americans began to speak of the Japanese medics not only as prisoners, but as part of the medical staff. Guards still watched, but less closely. An American nurse once placed a roll of clean bandages directly in Adler's hands, no counting, no hesitation. Adler later confessed in the dark, "I felt more trusted in that moment than I ever did in my own army." But beyond the wire, the war only grew darker. Rumors spread of firebombs consuming Tokyo, of German collapse in Europe, of weapons so powerful they could erase cities in a single strike. The Japanese prisoners huddled together at night, torn between disbelief and dread. In April, a fever epidemic swept the camp. Both POWs and guards fell ill. The Americans turned again to their unlikely allies. Day and night, Japanese medics moved between cots, dripping water into parched mouths, mixing medicines with trembling hands. Tanaka himself fell sick, his body racked with chills, but he forced himself upright, whispering, "If I stop, they stop." One morning the camp chaplain entered, his face weary but calm. Through the interpreter he asked all men, Americans, Japanese, prisoners and guards, to bow their heads. A prayer rose, words foreign to Tanaka's ears, but not to his heart. For the first time, he felt part of something larger than uniforms or flags. By summer, the war's end loomed like a storm cloud. Then, in August, the whispers came. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. A weapon of fire unlike any seen before. The Japanese medics sat stunned, unable to imagine their homeland turned to ash. Tanaka clutched his scraps of paper, whispering, "My family, are they shadows now?" Days later, the official word came. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The camp fell into a stunned silence. Americans cheered, some wept openly. The Japanese prisoners sat stone-faced, their world shattered. What followed was stranger still. Instead of execution or indefinite captivity, the medics were summoned by the American major. His words, translated carefully, struck them like thunder. "You will be released. You will go home. Many of you saved our men. That is remembered." Tanaka felt his knees weaken. Released? Home? He had not let himself imagine such a future. The farewell was quiet but unforgettable. The corporal from Kansas, still limping but alive, pressed something into Tanaka's hand. A dog tag. His own. "So you remember," he whispered. Tanaka bowed deeply, clutching the metal like a relic. When the Japanese medics finally marched out of the camp, their hands were empty of bandages but heavy with memory. They carried no rifles, no banners, only the knowledge that they had expected execution and found instead a different kind of duty. Years later, Tanaka returned to medicine in a ruined Tokyo. Patients called him doctor, and he answered, but always with the echo of that American voice in the jungle camp. In his diary, preserved bit, "I, his daughter," he had written, "We thought surrender meant shame. Yet mercy taught us that healing the enemy was not humiliation, but honor. History will remember the bombs, the battles, the numbers. But I will remember a camp in the Philippines where enemies called me doctor and thanked me for life.